And so glad Neil and Sherry are on the mend. And I hope everybody's well. And although we hoped it wouldn't happen, we're probably anticipating masking again and just protecting each other from the Delta variant. And I was thinking in anticipation of our gathering that we officially begin the high holiday season tomorrow. And we're going to talk about that this morning. And it creates a perfect segue to begin to study the book of Job. And I should say that, studying the book of Job is a formidable task. Sometimes people don't take it on. If people read Job on their own, it tends to create confusion and more questions than answers. But it's a very important story, and I think that it's going to engender a very, very important conversation for all of us. So I want to start today. Let's bring up first and let me move this. Go to that. There we go. And talk about preparing for the high holidays. They're coming up fast this year, as you know. They're Labor Day weekend on Monday, the 6th at night, beginning Monday night, with Rosh Hashanah. And to put the Jewish holidays in perspective, we should just say something about the Jewish calendar a little bit. Our calendar, the Jewish calendar, is different than the solar calendar or the Gregorian calendar that defines much of the world. Our religious calendar is a lunar calendar. It goes by the cycles of the moon. And it actually has its origin in Mesopotamia. The Hebrew calendar that was adopted by our Hebrew ancestors most certainly had its origin in Mesopotamian culture, because the names of the the names of the months have connections to the names of the months in many of them in the Mesopotamian calendar. The other thing worth noting is that in the earlier calendars of the world, people were very, very literal, and the first month of the year, so to speak, was always associated with springtime, with beginnings. And it's for that reason, for example, that in the Hebrew Bible, the month in which Pesach occurs, when Passover occurs, according to the Bible, is called the first month. And that is the month of Nisan. And Pesach occurs on the 15th day of 14th and 15th days of Nisan. And of course, thinking about the lunar month, the cycle of the month defined by the cycle of the moon. So a new moon, if you know your astronomy, a new moon means no moon. A new moon means no moon, and no moon means new month. So that's, if you can always kind of know where you stand in the cycle of a Jewish month by paying attention to the cycle of the moon. So if there's no moon, it's a new moon, and that means it's a new month in the Jewish calendar, because we go by the cycle of the moon. If it's the 14th or 15th day, the moon is going to be full. So if you see a full moon, you'll know you're right in the middle of a Jewish month. At any time during the year, any full moon, you're in the middle of a Jewish month. And a lot of our holidays are associated with a full moon, because in an agricultural society, full moons accorded 24-hour opportunities for harvesting and planting because of the light of the moon. And, our holidays have evolved. They've emerged over time, as has our calendar, beginning with the Mesopotamian calendar and then it being adopted by our ancestors because we encountered the Mesopotamian culture, interacted with them quite a bit, particularly in the time of Abraham and Sarah, in the earliest stages of our people's history. And so the Hebrew calendar, going by the moon, has not just 12 months. Some years it has 13 months. Because if we just went by the lunar calendar, 12 months, the length of a lunar month is shorter than the length of a solar month. And so what would happen, we would have 12 lunar months and we'd come up about 12 days short of the cycle of the sun. And what would that mean? It would mean every year the holidays would be a little earlier, and then the next year they'd be a little earlier, and then the next year they'd be a little earlier. And that's what we see that happens with the Jewish holidays every year. They move back and forth. And why do they move? So this year we say, Oy Gewalt, Rosh Hashanah is so early this year.
Yes. Sorry.
But in another year we're going to say, Oy Gewalt, Rosh Hashanah is so late. And why is that? Why does it, all of a sudden it'll shift back to the end of September? Because we'll add an extra month to keep the holidays in sync with their seasons. Because if we didn't do that, Rosh Hashanah would eventually happen in the winter after a few years. And, things would be all out of sync. Now, there are other religious calendars in the world that go by the moon, like Islam, but they don't correct their calendar with the sun. They let it cycle around, and that's why, for example, in Islam, that also goes by the moon, Ramadan can happen any time of the year because the lunar calendar gets 1 month earlier every year in relation to the sun, and they don't fix that. They don't correct that. In Judaism, we do correct that. So Rosh Hashanah is in the fall, Sukkot is in the fall, Pesach is in the spring. Everything occurs within a certain window in the seasons in which the holidays originated. And so when we talk about the Hebrew calendar, we have 12 names of 12 months that are different than the names of the Gregorian calendar. Excuse me, those months, as I mentioned at the beginning, and their names are very connected to the original Mesopotamian cycle. And we find ourselves now, this year, like every year, even though Rosh Hashanah is so early, it'll flip back to the end of September in a year from now. Otherwise, we'd have Rosh Hashanah first week of August, and that's too early. And the month that occurs right before Rosh Hashanah, okay, the month that Rosh Hashanah occurs in is called Tishrei, which the Bible calls the 7th month, because the Passover month is the first month for the real ancient ancestors of ours. Tishrei is the month of the Jewish New Year. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, actually was added to the cultural life of the Jewish people long time after they had been celebrating Passover. So Passover was the original sort of agricultural New Year, but then later in time they added Rosh Hashanah and superimposed it on top of the calendar. And Rosh Hashanah had a completely different meaning. Rosh Hashanah was a season for taking accounts. And it began first as the time of year when tithes were due to the government, and then the taking account also of the harvest, which gets fully realized with Sukkot. And then, as we think about it most of all, Rosh Hashanah becomes a time that we call a cheshbon hanefesh, a taking account of the soul. And that gets superimposed on top of our Hebrew calendar. Even though Tishrei is called the 7th month, it's a new year for us. It's considered the birthday of the world from that time period, that day. And so you see we have different cycles of time superimposed one on another. So we have Rosh Hashanah is a new year. We have, can anyone name some other cycle New Years that we celebrate in our Jewish calendar? Not just Rosh Hashanah, we have other New Years. So we have Pesach, which is kind of the new year of agriculture. How about this? How about
the new year for trees? That's
New
not
Year of
Shemitah,
the
it's
Trees.
New Year of the Trees? Excellent. Who remembers what that's called?
Tu B'Shvat.
Tu B'Shvat. Now, it's interesting. Shvat is the name of the month. Tu means 15. If you translate tu, it's actually saying the 15th of Shvat. And that's a new year for trees. Anybody know of any other New Years we celebrate? Believe it or not, we have a new year for grapes. And that's Tu B'Av, the 15th of the month of Av. So there are two examples of two other New Years we celebrate, in addition to Rosh Hashanah, in addition to Pesach. In the case of Rosh Hashanah, the whole month prior is considered a month of preparation. It's the month of Elul that begins tomorrow. Elul is very interesting because if you look down below here, here's the Hebrew spelling of the word Elul. And one interpretation to sort of suggest the meaning of the month is that each letter refers to a word and to a phrase, ani for the aleph, ledodi for the lamed, vidodi,
You hear me
vav.
yesterday?
What?
Oh, I think she was talking to somebody else.
Okay, I thought you were asking me to be asking a question. So here's the name of Elul in Hebrew, aleph, lamed, vav, lamed, and each letter refers to a word, ani, ledodi, vidodi, li. And what does that mean? It means, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Often written on wedding rings and ketubot. It's a statement connected to Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon as some call it. And the reason we interpret Elul this way is that Elul is the time when we're supposed to start to reflect and think about our relationships. Our relationships. Elul is also a reminder that the purpose of Rosh Hashanah is not just a quick, I'm sorry. You know, we get to Rosh Hashanah, we spend a good day, long day in the synagogue, we think about our lives and how to repair our mistakes. Elul is a reminder that it's not just a quick I'm sorry on Rosh Hashanah, that the process is more involved. And it's interesting, we go from the month of Av, in which we celebrate Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is a day of mourning for the great cataclysms of Jewish history, the destructions of the temple, the expulsion from Spain, and other things. The dark month of Av gives way to the hopeful month of Elul. Elul is the time of year when we're supposed to do an honest process of self-reflection. so that we don't show up on Rosh Hashanah to make a quick I'm sorry. It's interesting. Now, this also coincides with today's Torah portion. Today's Torah portion from Deuteronomy is called Re'eh, and it begins with the word Re'eh, and Re'eh means see, or understand, or discern. In Deuteronomy, Moses is giving speeches to the people before his death. And he's saying to them what it is, the essence of the Jewish religion. And he's conveying to them the basic message of Deuteronomy, which is, Re'eh, understand this. And this is the main message of Deuteronomy over and over and over again, because Deuteronomy is if then. If you follow the commandments, then you will receive blessing. And all of those precepts begin often with the word re'eh, to discern. And so this Torah portion often coincides with the beginning of Elul as well, because Elul is the month when we're supposed to begin that process of discernment about our lives. Now, there are customs associated with the month of Elul, and most notably, during the month of Elul, every morning, at the end of the morning service, except on Shabbat, it's customary to blow the shofar every single day. And the reason we blow the shofar every single day in Elul is, again, to promote this idea of awakening before Rosh Hashanah gets here. The second custom, most associated with the month of Elul, is that every morning of every day of the month, we add this psalm to the worship service. Psalms chapter 27. And it says this, and it's interesting. I'll read it through, and then we can take a moment and see what you think it's trying to tell us. It's a Psalm of David, by David. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Whom shall I dread? When the evildoers approached me to devour my flesh, my oppressors and my foes, they stumbled and fell. If an army were to beleaguer me, my heart would not fear. If war to arise against me, in this I trust. One thing I have asked of the Lord, this I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the pleasantness of the Lord and to visit his sanctuary. For he will hide me in his tabernacle on a day of adversity. He will conceal me in the hidden places of his tent. He will lift me upon a rock. And then my head will be raised above my enemies around me, and I will offer in his tabernacle sacrifices of jubilation. I will sing and chant to the Lord. Lord, hear my voice as I call. Be gracious to me and answer me. In your behalf, my heart says, seek my countenance. Your countenance, Lord, I seek. Do not conceal your countenance from me. Do not cast aside your servant in wrath. You have been my help. Do not abandon me nor forsake me, God of my deliverance. Though my father and mother have forsaken me, the Lord has taken me in. Lord, teach me your way. Lead me in your path of righteousness because of my watchful enemies. Do not give me over to the will of my oppressors, for there have risen against me false witnesses, and they speak evil. They would have crushed me had I not believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Hope in the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart be valiant, and hope in the Lord. It's such an amazingly powerful, affirmative psalm. I mean, talk about developing confidence in your soul is expressed in this psalm. What do you all think of this? And imagine this is what we're supposed to say it every single day for this entire month, every morning, to start every morning of this month. with these feelings and sentiments. What do you all think?
Well, I just put in there to have a sounds like David had such a heart for God, and he wanted to have this relationship with him, and him personally toward God, and then he knows God's benefits will come to him, the protection, and he will be with him. It's like wanting to be with your love. You're going to be in the house of his, and you have that nearness relationship.
Yes. And again, going back to Ello, Ani Ladodi Vidodi Li, this I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, the notion of relationship is so beautifully expressed in this psalm. Anyone else? How does this psalm make you feel? As a way of preparing for the awe of the Jewish holidays.
This actually brought tears to my eyes, Rabbi Lennick. It's really beautiful
It
in
is.
seeking the protection of the higher, power and God, and just, be able to relax into that protection and see that as a salvation. Really, it's really beautiful.
It is. There's something about this psalm, and it's interesting that they singled it out just to be said during this month. There's something about the interior life of every person where we all have doubts. We all have self-doubts. I think there's a healthy amount. There's also an unhealthy amount, but there's a healthy amount of anxiety, trepidation that's important in life that just helps us be aware of the boundaries of our strengths and weaknesses, and to be able to have a reflection like this, a mantra like this, which says, you're not alone. You're never alone. That there's a spiritual presence, and by acknowledging it and drawing it in to yourself, it will give you strength to confront anything, whatever it might be that life brings, the good and the challenging. And when I read this morning, it was interesting. I got goosebumps when I read it. So we can go into the high holidays. A lot of people have a lot of dread about the high holidays. And what this psalm points out is that's not what the purpose is. The purpose is not for us to feel dread or even fear. Even though we have these motifs of, the book of life and the book of judgment, and we call, Rosh Hashanah, the day of remembrance, and Yom Kippur, the day of judgment, and there's a lot of, dramatic, imposing, even intimidating language and symbolism in the prayer book and some of the language. This is saying, don't worry. But heighten your awareness. Open your soul. Open your heart. I experience this as reminding me to open my heart and my soul to the idea of a spiritual presence. Because if I can do that, then I'm going to be prepared to open my heart and soul to other people, to make teshuvah, to make repentance.
There's a lot of overlap between that and the Lord's Prayer, or the 23rd Psalm, I mean.
You mean the 23rd Psalm?
Yeah, the 23rd Psalm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a comfort, the notion of being in the presence of mine enemies, my cup runneth over. You set a table before me in the presence of my enemies.
Yeah.
Even if I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me.
Right.
Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It is very similar. It's a prayer of comfort, but I think it's also a prayer of reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a very good point. So in the season of Elul, we do have this, kind of imposing idea that we're preparing for judgment. And we call it the days of awe, Yamim Noraim. But really what we have the opportunity to do during Elul is to begin to prioritize teshuvah. And what is teshuvah? That's our word for repentance. But what does it really mean? Teshuvah literally means turning. So turning means to change direction. So the idea of repentance in Judaism, it's not just about apology, it's not just about reparation, but it's about change. And it's interesting, in the Jewish religion, forgiveness has a number of steps. The first is a person's recognition of the mistake. The second is apologizing for the mistake to the person that's been injured. Third is then asking, what can I do to repair the mistake? But guess what? There's a fourth stage in Judaism in the process of forgiveness. And that is really where we get to teshuvah, is the fourth stage. And that's when you literally change direction. So the next time you're in the same situation, you do the right thing, not the wrong thing that you did the time at the beginning. And I know I've mentioned this here before, but it's a beautiful concept of repair, repentance, and forgiveness in Judaism, because full repentance, full repair, full forgiveness doesn't happen until the lesson of the mistake is actually learned, and the next time around you don't make it again. Because if you apologize, if you recognize you made a mistake and you apologize to someone, and then you ask them, what can I do to fix this? And they tell you, and you do all those things, and then next time you do the same thing again, you haven't learned a thing, and you certainly aren't forgiven. Forgiveness is really about change. And the thing about Judaism that's so beautiful is that it's predicated on the notion that people can change. Right? We don't believe in original sin. Original sin says there are some things you can't change. There are some things you can't change. You can't change your inherent condition of human sinfulness. You've inherited it from your earliest ancestor, and not only, it's never actually repaired, it's mitigated in Christianity through baptism. Baptism will mitigate against original sin, but it doesn't remove it. It just neutralizes it. And there's always this recognition in Christian traditions of the inherent, when I studied the philosophy of religion in college, we talked about the stained stained condition of the soul. And that's what original sin says. Your soul is stained originally. And there's no way to really, you can paint over the stain with baptism, but the stain is always there. Judaism doesn't believe in that. We don't believe the soul is stained. We actually say, we read it in the morning prayer, the soul that you have given me, O God, is pure. Pure. The notion that the soul is like a tabula rasa, it's a clean slate when we come into this world. How can anybody look at a newborn baby and say that creature is stained at the core? Makes no sense. But in due respect to those who believe that, in Judaism, we have a completely different view of human nature that is not stained, and that while the soul is pure, we will make mistakes. We will choose the right way, and we will choose the wrong way. Sometimes we will have the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, will dominate, and we'll make the right choice. And sometimes the Yetzer Ra, the not good inclination, will dominate, and we'll make the wrong choice. But Judaism says, the message of Teshuvah says, we can always change. So next time, the Yetzer Tov is in charge. And that is like such a hopeful message about human nature. The way I often describe it to people is, I remember when I, being a young parent, back in the 90s, with Sarah, my daughter Sarah, who's turning 25 this week. That blows my mind, but she turned 25. And back in the day, it's like back in the day in the 90s. I can't believe that's what we say. Back in the day, in the 1990s, there was kind of like a linguistic shift about describing children when they did the wrong thing. Like when I was growing up, my mother used to say to me, "You bad boy, you bad boy." And that psychologist started saying, you shouldn't say that, because you should talk about bad behavior, but not say the child is bad. Sounds like a fine distinction, but it's kind of like gets to the heart of why Judaism is different. Judaism looks at the mistakes we made and doesn't say, "You bad boy, you bad person, you bad human." It says, that was a bad choice. You can do better. You need to repair the bad choice, and next time make the right choice. And so Ello is the time of year where we have this chance to prepare for this. And I say prioritize teshuvah. And what does that mean? There's an old story. It's a great story about two people that go to the rabbi. And, one person's done this terribly, terribly, terribly bad thing. And goes to the rabbi and says, I need you to, go out to the prairie. I want you to find the biggest rock you can find. And that rock going to represent, your big bad thing. And I want you to pick up the rock and bring it back to me. Guy goes, lugs this gigantic rock back to the rabbi and says, "How'd that feel?" He said, "That was hard. That was difficult." He said, "Well, you can fix one big bad thing. Go talk to your friend and make it teshuvah." Another person comes to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I've done a cartload of bad little things. Cartload of bad little things. And I don't know what to do. Rabbi says, I want you to go out to the prairie. I want you to pick up a little stone for every single little bad thing you did. Person goes out to the prairie and picks up the little stones and can't carry them all. And says, I guess I have to get a sack. Starts putting all the little stones in the sack, but the sack is too heavy to lift. Goes back to the rabbi and says, I gathered up the little stones for all the little things. He said, but it's too heavy to lift. He said, He said, and that needs to be your lesson. Now you have to go back to each and every one of those individuals one at a time. And you have to make a teshuvah with every single one of them. And every time you make a teshuvah, take one stone out of the sack. And eventually you'll be able to carry the sack. And then eventually you'll be able to empty the sack. And the lesson in that, it's kind of a beautiful story, really, because, Ello is the time where we start to, separate the big stones from the small ones. And decide, what are we going to tackle first? And I always say, tackle the big ones first. Then you don't have to lug them around. And then tackle the small ones and take one out of the sack at a time. And that's what Elul does. Elul is the inventory time. And then we get to Rosh Hashanah. And now, just to point out, Rosh Hashanah begins a 10-day period called the 10 Days of Repentance. But believe it or not, the first 9 days, it's just not about going to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and apples and wine, and all the celebration of Rosh Hashanah is actually supposed to be a very uplifting holiday, birthday of the world. But for 9 days, we're supposed to go and actually empty the rocks out of our sack. Between us and other people, it's about making teshuvah with other human beings. And then, on Yom Kippur, 1 day only, to make teshuvah with God. Because the way God is, according to Jewish tradition, if you look at the Sistine Chapel picture of God and Adam, and God is reaching out to Adam, and Adam is going like this. On Yom Kippur, God is reaching out to all of us. And even if we're doing this, God's reaching out. And that's why our teshuvah with God is so much easier and only requires a day. Because God is ready to forgive us 1,000 times over. Forgiveness, exponential forgiveness on Yom Kippur, and that's why it doesn't take long when it comes to, we ask God to forgive us for the mistakes we've made against God. God doesn't forgive us for the mistakes we make against people. And so we need the 9 days to empty the little stones from the sack. And who knows, we might need only an hour on Yom Kippur to come to peace with God for something we've done wrong in relationship to God, our own personal, divine source. The power greater than us, however we may understand that. So that's all I wanted to share just by way of introduction to the holidays. Let's see, what time is it? Oh, good, we can start Job. I just want to pause right there at that point and see if anyone has any comments about what we've shared so far today.
I do.
Please.
This just occurs to me as we're talking. The whole tradition is about the person who has committed an error or an offense against another person. But what about the person? Does our tradition speak to anything about the person who was hurt by the error? What are we supposed to do?
Good question. So, Jewish tradition is quite explicit about it. So the first thing Jewish tradition says is that when someone asks for forgiveness, we have a real obligation to grant it. Because if we don't, then we actually invert the pain of the offense, and the resentment and the unwillingness to try to forgive kind of doubles up the pain of being a victim and overlays it with the pain of resentment on top of it. So that there's the pain of being mistreated, the pain of being a victim, the pain of being, clearly an offense, the object of an offense against you. But if you refuse to consider forgiveness, then now you're adding to that the burden of resentment. And Jewish tradition says that depletes the joy of living. And so the joy of living is depleted on top of the pain of victimization. But the tradition is realistic and says, but not everybody's going to forgive right away. So Maimonides talked about this in some detail and said, now speaking to the perpetrator, if you go and ask forgiveness and they say no, then you should go back with a witness and ask for forgiveness again. And they say, and if the person still says no, now you've gone back and humbled yourself a second time with a witness, humbling yourself a second time. It says, you go back again with 2 witnesses and try to make it teshuva. It says, and if the person's not ready to forgive you, you go away and you come back with 3 witnesses and you try again, yet again. And then it says, and if the person's not ready to forgive you and they send you away, they said you go away now and come back with 4 witnesses. You humble yourself in front of 4 witnesses and the perpetrator. They said, and if then the perpetrator still won't talk to you about forgiveness, still completely unwilling in any way to talk about make amends, you have to walk away with humility and no longer blame yourself. It's not it's not a perfect equation but at least it's something to answer your question. That tradition says if someone's willing to come back 4 times with 4 people there to attest to the sincerity of your apology and desire for forgiveness, and still you've been hurt so badly you're not prepared to do that, tradition feels sad for everybody in that. Feels sad for the perpetrator who really is trying to make amends, and sad for the victim who's so hurt and damaged. But we can all imagine situations, or maybe we've been in situations where things have happened to us that feel unforgivable. And that's why life is a long journey. And I call it a long journey no matter how many years your life is. I once read a saying that said, a long life may not be good enough, but a good life is usually always long enough. And so you can live a long life in a state of resentment, and then look back at the end and say, what did I lose as a result of all that resentment? Or you can try to generate goodness even in the face of the worst things. And from my perspective as a person on the path, no more ahead of anybody else. That we all have to negotiate that inside ourselves in different ways. I'm just the kind of person, I don't know, I'm not a grudge holder, but I don't forget. I forget it's interesting, I forget little things. But I've had experiences in my life where people around me have made choices that really caused a lot of pain. And while I've forgiven it, I've moved on from it. I not that, for example, in one case, that person's never apologized or even believed that there was anything that was wrong, and I just know I'll never trust that person again. But I don't. I moved off of. I got through the feelings of anger and resentment that I did feel for a long time.
So I guess that you're getting to the other part of my question, which is, in my experience, the people who do cause the most pain do not ask forgiveness because they are not even aware or don't care to be aware of their actions.
Correct.
So are we supposed to do the tshuva for them by forgiving, even though they haven't asked? And they will not ask.
I don't think Judaism, I've never heard of the notion of doing tshuva for someone else. I don't want to say that as a blanket statement because, for example, I think it's possible to make tshuva with someone who's dead.
Yes.
And so I think that's possible. But I'm going to assume that just on the face value of it, a dead person's not in a position to answer me directly, to engage with me in the normal sense of teshuvah. I've counseled people over the years. This is actually real life story. I developed a technique years ago because I had people come to me as a rabbi and say, you know, my parent died, and they were horrible to me, and I carry around this burden my whole life of anger at my parent, and I can't seem to let it go. And so I don't know where I thought this up. I just thought it up one day, and I said, we're gonna go get some. I used to use Quaker oats. We're gonna take some Quaker oats. We're gonna make a pile on a table, little pile of Quaker oats, and next to the pile of Quaker oats, we're gonna make a little pile of flour. Now what you're going to do is going to think about your mother, your father, whichever parent it is, and let's let the Quaker oats represent all the bad stuff, the chaff. And just be honest, anything that was good about your parent, even superficial things, represent the flour. And take a little portion, take whatever portion of the flour, you know, the ratio of the good, and then collect the Quaker oats, the ratio of the bad. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take all the Quaker oats, the ratio of the bad, and we're going to put it in a little bag. We're going to tie it up with a little ribbon. And we're going to take the flour and we're going to put it in another little bag. We're going to tie it up in a ribbon. And then we're going to go to your parents' grave. And here's what we're going to do, what you're going to do. We're going to, you know, you can't talk to your parent. They can't answer you. I said, but you don't have to carry around the burden of the chaff any longer. And I want you to open up the little bag of the chaff, and I want you to scatter it into the wind. And whatever amount of little flour you have, I want you to take it home with you today and just put it in a special place. And I can't tell you, I mean, I think I did that little ritual I've done it with a dozen people. And virtually in every case, it changed their feelings. It allowed them to feel some release from the chaff. Now, why does that symbolism matter? What it does is it symbolizes that people have a choice to hold on to the anger, the resentment, to hold on to the chaff, or to throw it away and just keep the fine flour, even if it's like that much. And I think we can actually do that with people who've passed away, and I think that's a kind of a ritual of teshuvah right there. Now, people who are alive still and recalcitrant, narcissistic, egomaniacal, even sociopathic,
Yes.
Judaism is very clear about that as well. That as painful as it is, we have to distance ourselves from those people as completely as necessary
Yes.
to protect us from re-experiencing the resentment of their original offense.
I agree.
But as I say, just remember, these are not doctrines. These are discernments.
Rabbi Lennick, I like this because it's so hard to grow if you are always feeling hurt. So by letting go in the way you prescribe, my chance of evolving and having a better life and learning more and evolving my soul beyond what was, from the time of the hurt, that's what gives me hope about this, because I'm not condemning myself by seeing myself only through the hurt, so that's why it's such a good release. In my opinion, it's a wonderful liberation.
I think that at the heart of Judaism is this notion of choice. And, it's a cliche at this point. We hear it all the time. It's, a mantra of pop psychology, but it's actually profound because so many people have a hard time achieving this, and that is that, we don't have control, literally, over the actions of others. But we do have control over our reactions to others. And we do have some control. I mean, look, there are things that interfere with that. There's, mental illness, there's anxiety, there's depression. There are things that interfere with our ability to maintain an attitude, not of indifference, but of self-esteem and self-respect. There are things that get in the way with that. But Judaism's basic idea is that we have a choice whether or not to, as I hate to use this, but as Michelle Obama put it, go low or go high. And I don't say that's not a political statement. I just thought it was the way she described that was really quite wonderful. When other people go low, we don't have to go low. We can go high. And when people do the most atrocious things to us, vengeance, ultimately may feel momentarily satisfying, but then we burden ourselves with doing something wrong knowingly. And in some ways, vengeance is worse than the original offense. Because people can commit original offense and as was said, they may not even know it. They have any clue or have no self-awareness whatsoever.
Right.
But vengeance is like a premeditated, conscious act of anger. And, I mean, you could argue based on that, vengeance somehow is a much more heavy behavior than necessarily the original offense. But I can also understand why people feel vengeful. And I can understand why people, want to lash out at people that have done the most horrific things. And so that's why we say it's a process. It's an open-ended process. But I do agree with that the only way we can really grow is if we unburden ourselves with the anger and resentments created by others. And I think that's at the heart of teshuvah in Judaism. And I have to say, I'm very grateful for these conversations we have. Because I believe even if, we don't pick up every detail of the lesson or whatever, the fact that there's a thing in Jewish tradition about having conversations l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. So we don't necessarily come away with an answer, but we come away with something. I'm not sure what it is, but we come away with something good. I just think we do. I mean, I think that, I don't know, I like to think maybe God sits around and has these kinds of conversations too, you know? And, that's why that's what makes being human so special. I mean, we get to have these kind of conversations. I'm not sure other creatures do. I think it'd be cool if they do, maybe in their own way. But to be able to actually talk about mercy and peace and how to bring those out in the world, and that basic question is how do you help the world be a more peaceful, kinder place? And we can make all the intellectual arguments, education, opportunity, blah blah blah, but I'm still a believer. I think it's probably the core of my beliefs that the only way to bring goodness in the world is to bring goodness in the world. Whenever you have an opportunity, err on the side of goodness. It's not perfection. It's not righteousness either. It's not about being right. It's not about the truth. It's just about engendering a spirit of goodness. And you can't do that if you're in a state of resentment. You just can't. I don't think. At least I can't.
So what about those pebbles and those smaller things? Like sometimes part of my amends are about, times that I've been irritable or trying to be controlling or whatever. And I continue to work on them, but I know that that's not something that's going to totally disappear from me, So do we make those amends, or what's your advice on something like that?
Can you say the question again? I'm not sure I fully understand what you're asking. Like,
Yeah, it's like sometimes, like with my son, I'll say, I'm sorry for the times that, that I was telling you too much what to do, or being controlling, or with my partner. And so it's something that I continue to work on. But when you say that the next time the opportunity comes up, you do something different and you make the change, I don't expect those things to totally go away from me. I work on it, but I probably, I will continue to be irritable at times. I will continue to, at times, probably step over what I should be saying to my son or my wife. So, and I try to take care of those things at the time,
yeah,
but
right. Well, first of all, you just said the key thing. You try to take care of them at the time.
uh-huh.
I don't think Judaism is counseling us to do something like, going to one of the closest people in our lives and saying, God, I'm really sorry that I'm a complex, kind of messed up person sometimes. I just don't think that's what this is about.
Uh-huh.
We're all a package deal, right?
Right.
Now, it's one thing if you have a child, let's say you have a child who comes to you at some point in life and says, I've needed to tell you this for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, and and the thing is, how great is it that this child can now tell you this?
Right.
And that could only probably be taking place because either the child is getting support to allow that to happen, or you've changed too.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like just confrontation. It's like, Mom, I got to tell you this because, I don't. It's funny you're mentioning this because I only wish my mother was alive, because I think I'd have a lot of those things to say to her right now on the positive side
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't get to tell her when she was alive because I was too discombobulated in what I thought was my own terribly complex life at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's like, I don't think it's about blanket, forgive me for being me.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you deal with it situationally. And if a child comes back and says, man, it was hard growing up. Do you realize how hard, do you know what was going on? Do you realize? And then, you can say, yeah, it's like, whatever it is. I never told you that, but during those years, I dealt with depression or whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is. Or during those years, I was working out things in my identity and I couldn't be there the way I should have been.
Mm-hmm.
But now, look where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the other piece of this conversation is that I just wrote a little article about this for the Federation newspaper, and I talked about forgiveness is forgiveness more than an act, is an attitude.
Yeah.
That forgiveness is, having the attitude of cutting people slack,
Mm-hmm.
just in general, and not rushing to judgment, and realizing every human being is a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And that, forgiveness is, not just about the forgiven, but for the forgiver.
Mm-hmm.
And, but the main thing is that, what all human beings have in common to one degree or another, depending on people's level of self-awareness or the ability to even reflect, we're all trying to figure this thing out that we're part of called life and find meaning. And when you realize everybody else is muddling through just as much as you are, it ought to lend itself to just like a little more chill with each other. So, Judaism is not about character self-loathing. It's not about. See, that's very interesting. I can't believe I've never said this before. As much as there's this whole schmear about Jewish guilt, and as much as there's this whole schmear, there's a lot of like so-called. I mean, look, if you look at Woody Allen as a caricature, self-loathing, like Jewish self-loathing, and there is such a thing as Jewish self-loathing. There is a thing for some Jewish people where their Jewish ethnicity has impacted their psychic stability and their self-loathing and second-guessing, and it's a part of this inherent. There's a thing, it's actually been studied and documented around Jewish exceptionalism, that, Jews have a perception we have to be exceptional in this world because we've been rejected so much. And it gets translated into psychological patterns of behavior inside Jewish family systems. And it's that reason, for example, this might not surprise you, Jews have a higher incidence of hypochondriacal behavior. Why do Jews have a higher incidence of being hypochondriacs? Because we're so afraid of being sick unconsciously, because being sick means being unexceptional. Now, this is psychological language, or psychic, a way of describing a psychic outlook. And, so while we have this thing of Jewish self-loathing that I think is a manifestation of Jewish exceptionalism, I hope what I'm saying is making sense. I don't believe at the heart of Judaism and the message of Judaism, the holidays and Teshuvah, is to encourage self-loathing. I think quite the opposite. I think it's trying to encourage hopeful realism about ourselves and each other. But I mean, Jews are experts at self-loathing. There's no question about that.
Wasn't it back in the old days in Leviticus? They knew that we were going to make mistakes, so you got to do all these sacrifices, and we don't have them. We don't have sacrifices.
No, we don't have the same rituals to kind of help us purge. Those primitive rituals were about purging. It's called substitution theology. And of course, Christianity is squarely the inheritor of substitution theology. And Judaism is no longer inherently about substitution theology. Although, we pray 3 times a day as a reminder of the ancient sacrifices, and we talk about the ancient sacrifices, and even the ultra-Orthodox pray to return to the ancient sacrifices, and I have some real loathing about that, but that's a whole nother discussion. We've replaced substitution theology, sacrifices that will take away our self-loathing. This will die, and that will lift our burden in whatever form it exists. And the burden that we carry will go up in smoke with the sacrifice. We've replaced that with prayer, study, and deeds of loving kindness. Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, called the three pivotal, parts of Judaism as distinct from ancient Israelite religion.
How and where did that get substituted? I mean, that's huge. How did
It's huge, and it got substituted because, understand, we were a sacrificial civilization, like many other ancient civilizations, our sacrificial rules were different. We didn't sacrifice humans. We sacrifice all kinds of things: animals, bread, wheat. We had all kinds of offerings. And they were all in the realm of substitution theology. But that eventually, which began as a tribal practice, then with the Mosaic tradition, became centralized first when Aaron and the priesthood were designated in the Torah. And so now you had the people, you had Moses, the political leader, and then you had this sort of priesthood that conducted those sacrifices they were all Levites, actually, by birth, and they conducted this system. And then when the Israelites went into the land of Israel and the ancient nation was set up, I mean, really, the first king was Saul, but we argue that the real country didn't exist until David set up Jerusalem. When David set up Jerusalem, Jerusalem became the center of those ancient sacrifices. Although there were people performing them in the hinterlands, out and about in other places, the main sacrificial holidays, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the pilgrimage festivals were called such because the Israelites had to travel to Jerusalem and bring animals for sacrifice, or they could buy animals outside for sacrifice. And that sacrificial system, that substitution theology, became a socio-economic institution. The temple was destroyed then in 586 BCE by Babylonians, and the sacrifices didn't completely stop at that time. They were interrupted. But remember, during that first exile, a lot of Jews stayed in Jerusalem, and they still, on a very small scale, had priests that were conducting sacrifices. Then the temple was rebuilt a second time, and then, under the Romans in the year 70, the temple was destroyed completely. And at that time, the priesthood that ran the sacrifices was dismantled. And the sacrifices have never been carried out since then. When that happened, you can't even imagine the type of cataclysm it was. The Jews were, exiled all around the Mediterranean basin, and they formed little tiny survivor communities in and around and outside ancient Israel. And inside those ancient little communities, there already was in existence, before the temple was destroyed, rabbis, teachers, leaders of the community who were different type of leaders than the priesthood leaders. Just to put it in history, the Sadducees that were in power when the temple was destroyed were of the priesthood, believing in the sacrifices. The Pharisees were not of the priesthood. They were the interpreting class. They added an oral law to the Torah. They taught the people sacrifices were not the only way to heaven. When the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees kind of were out of a job. The priesthoods had no job. There were no more sacrifices. And the Pharisees that were the rabbinical community, they took over in these small communities. And what happened is they began in these little communities conversations about how can we keep this religion alive until the sacrifices come back, because they believed they would come back. And they began a conversation of these three principles: study, worship, and deeds of loving kindness. What's fascinating is these conversations were happening in these little tiny communities, these outposts of Jewish life, until finally in the year 150. So, you're talking about only 80 years after the destruction of the temple, in the year 150, one of those rabbis, whose name was Judah the Prince, Judah Hanasi, called together all these different rabbinical leaders from all these different little outpost communities, and they gathered together and they discussed, how can we unify in order to survive? And they came together and they wrote the original book of Judaism, as distinct from the Torah, which was, in a way, the book of Israelite religion. And that's what they did, and they wrote what we now know is the Mishnah. And it was the writing of the Mishnah in the year 150 that literally launched and codified what we know as Judaism, as distinct from the sacrificial, priestly-led tradition that grew out of the biblical story of the patriarchs, and then Moses, and then the judges, and then the early kings. And then we have really the birth of Judaism, which coincides very closely with the birth of Christianity. They went through a very similar process, but not until 150 years later, and they had the Council of Nicaea, and they codified their tradition into what became the basis of a new religion. Judaism did it 150 years earlier, and still always anticipated the return of the temple would be rebuilt a third time, and the sacrifices would be resumed. So I hope does that answer your question, Sherry?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I can just imagine there must have been so many people who, if they really believed that those sacrifices were essential
Oh,
to, redemption or whatever. I mean, I can only imagine it must have been a really, really, really big thing to let that go.
right. But the thing is, the second time around, which really led to the obliteration of the temple itself and the institutions that supported it, remember, the Jews, the Israelites, they'd been through it one time before, and they'd already survived it once. And so they believed they would survive it again. And they believed, by the way, it's worth noting, you want to know where this notion of Messiah comes from. Here you have these little tiny outpost communities, these exiled groups of Jews who've been thrown out, sort of sent out into the surrounding areas, living in these little outpost communities, and they're hoping to regain their independence. They're hoping to regain their temple, regain their sacrifices, and they believe there would be a Messiah, a Mashiach, a Jewish Mashiach, a human being like King David, human in every respect, not a cosmic Messiah, in any sense of the word, a Jewish king of the Jews who would actually come back and beat back the Emperor of Rome and the Roman Empire. And there are a lot of people saying, I'm that guy, and every time someone said that, the Romans would crucify that guy. People think Jesus was the only so-called king of the Jews crucified by the Romans, but there were many, many, many others who were saying, I'm going to lead the war against Rome. But in the end, the Zealots on their own went to war, and they lost. And the temple was destroyed, and we were dispersed. And then in the midst of that dispersion, and that goes to the genius of the Jewish religion, in the midst of and the Jewish civilization, actually, in the midst of that dispersion, we were able to have a renaissance, a recreation of our civilization, our religious culture. And we didn't just do, the thing that's essential is to remember that birth of Judaism with Judah the Prince and the Mishnah, they didn't come up with all that on their own. They had been influenced by Hellenism, Greek philosophy, the idea of reason, and and this has been the genius of Judaism. We've always been able to integrate the best structures of the outer cultures wherever we've lived, and we've integrated them into the continuing renaissance of the Jewish civilization. We did it under the Roman Empire with the influence of Hellenism. We came up with Judaism. We did it in the golden age of Spain in our interactions with the Muslim world, in creating philosophy, science, astronomy, medicine. We've always been involved in integrating the great intellectual structures of every time period, and then having Judaism, synthesize those things, not only into new versions and understandings of Judaism, but into greater contributions to the world as a whole. I can't believe I just said that. I wish I had recorded it, because it describes. No, I'm serious, because occasionally I have these synthetic moments. But that's been a remarkable thing. We did it in the golden age of Spain. We did it during the Enlightenment. We did it after the Holocaust. We did it. The Judaism of the United States is all this integrated, synthesized, on the one hand highly intellectual and at the same time highly pragmatic, version of this unfolding religious civilization. By the way, what I just said may have been unique, but conceptually it's not. I'm describing the view of Jewish history that was articulated by Mordecai Kaplan, in case you're interested. And if you want to read more about this concept of Jewish history as evolving and drawing upon the elder civilization in a synthetic way to then come up with something new and creative that has adapted to the changes in intellectual history, read a book by Kaplan called Judaism as a Civilization, which is his original main work. He wrote many other things too.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting.
And also, let's face it, you look, how did these people, back to your original question, and I love the question, love it so much, because sometimes people think Judaism has just been this static thing that's been hanging on all this time, hanging on by a thread, and it's not true. We are the greatest story of adaptability probably in the history of the world, and you go back and you ask yourselves, in that first, after the year 70 and before the year 150, before the Mishnah was issued, how did they do it? How did they manage to survive? And we know they feverishly started to write things down, and they feverishly started to tell stories so they wouldn't be forgotten. And they feverishly came up with substitute rituals that people could do at home in place of the sacrifices. And they feverishly told people, we've been here before, we'll get through it again. But it's a marvel, really, of history when you think about it.
So not to I don't want to belabor it or anything, but I'm just curious, when they gave up the sacrifices, was it more by choice or did they have to? Why did they make that change?
They had to. First of all, they all believed that sacrifices had to be conducted in the temple.
Oh, and the temple was destroyed. So
the temple was destroyed.
Okay.
And there was a debate up until that time. We even had a divided kingdom over the debate. Israel was one country until there was, a big debate. Why there were people living in the north saying, why the heck do we have to schlep all the way to Jerusalem all the time? Why can't we have our own sanctuary up north? Why can't we have a northern satellite? Do you realize the economic burden it is for us to schlep all the way to Jerusalem 3 times a year? And we come to Jerusalem and we bring all this stuff, and it only benefits the economy of Jerusalem. And the Israelites living in the north said, forget it. It's just not fair. And the kings of that time period were like, well, too bad. We like getting rich off of all you people. And guess what? It led to virtually a civil war over that issue. And the northern kingdom was formed. And that's why we had Judah and Israel, two different kingdoms of Israel, over the issue, really, of the centralization of sacrifices in Jerusalem. And that debate, even after the divided kingdom and the kingdom was reunited, continued throughout time. And so but there was still, the people in charge said Jerusalem is the place, and it has to be the place. It says so here in the Bible. It's where David brought the ark. It's where the whole deal was set up. It has to remain there. And when the temple was destroyed, they said, well, now we can't do sacrifices anymore until the temple's rebuilt. We're certainly not going to tell people to do sacrifices out in the hinterlands because, number one, we don't have priests that can supervise it. And number two, we've never been in favor of sacrifices outside of Jerusalem. So it was really by socio-political necessity that there were no sacrifices. And to this day, even you look at an Orthodox Siddur prayer book, you'll see small print at the end of the Amidah, and it says, may it be your will, O Lord, and they believe this literally, may it be your will, O Lord, our God, that in our time speedily the ancient temple shall be rebuilt and the sacrifices reinstituted as in the days of old. And they say it every time they say the Amidah. Every time. And that's why you have very, very, very ultra Orthodox people who are preparing for that. They study specifically the laws of the Talmud and the Bible having to do with sacrifices because this group has supernatural beliefs that at some time there is going to be a Jewish cosmic Messiah, and that Jewish cosmic Messiah, which I think is not really a Jewish idea, is going to come and going to go, boom, there's going to be an apocalyptic event, and the temple's going to go, boom, it's going to be rebuilt a third time in Jerusalem, and we're going to go back in time 2,000 years. As I said earlier, talk about self-loathing. I loathe that idea. Because I happen to think if we really, in the real world in which we live, if we think Judaism is really about turning the clock back, they've missed the point altogether. We've never turned the clock back. We've always turned the clock forward in the way Kaplan describes. Because if we go to build a new temple in Jerusalem, have fun. You'll have to destroy 2 mosques that are in the second most holy place in the Islamic religion. And even though we can argue they shouldn't have been there to begin with, and they're standing where our temple used to stand, unless the Muslims voluntarily want to say, hey, Jewish people, we love you so much, we're sorry we built our mosques on your spot, and we're going to go move them, down the road, I think, you're talking about, you want to talk about apocalypse? Yeah, that would be the end of the world. So I loathe that idea that Orthodox Jews read at the end of the Amidah. I understand the sentimentality of it. Maybe they want to build a Jerusalem temple in their heart and have sacrifices within the heart. I'm all for that.
Yeah, I would not make a good Orthodox Jew. Yeah.
Well, but the thing is, again, I go back to your original question. How have we managed to, accomplish this? And it's because we've always adapted and integrated with current reality. And we've managed to do that so well that we've grown and evolved and, become better over the course of time. Last thing I'll say, I know we've run late. Let me just make one last point. some people in the ultra-Orthodox community, and I don't mean to criticize them, I just have a difference of opinion. There is a view in ultra-Orthodoxy based on a phrase in the Talmud that it says Hildadarut Hadorot, the degeneration of the generations. And it's a view of history. It's a view that says the further we get away from Mount Sinai, the further we get away from sacrifices, the further we get away from the temple, the further we get away from the original priesthood, the further we get away from the ancient form of our religion, the more degenerate Judaism becomes. That it becomes less authentic, less connected, and less correct. And so there's a tendency in traditional Judaism to want to turn the clock back, to stop this degeneration of the generations. Whereas I subscribe, and others do too, to a notion of not a degenerating of the generations, but an evolving of the generations. And that in fact, although we say memory is the key to redemption, we never forget the past, survival, integration, creativity, renaissance is the key to the future. It's just a different, you talk about concepts of history, concepts of Jewish history, and they are two different concepts of Jewish history. And why do we have more than one concept of Jewish history? Because we're Jews, that's why.
A room of 10 Jews, you got 15 opinions. Yeah.
Exactly. And there are more than just two concepts of Jewish history, too.
Yeah. This is fascinating, though. Thank you.
So next month we'll start with Job.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank you
much
so
today.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
This was
Thank you.
wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I know that we're
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you for the great questions. I love it when we're all together. So stay well.
Shabbat shalom. Bye. Shabbat shalom.
everybody.
Good Shabbos. Stay well.
Bye.
Shabbat shalom.